We're going to be talking about Akram Khan's Giselle for English National Ballet, which premiered 2 years ago in Manchester and has been touring ever since, and all of us have heard about it and seen bits of it in video. So we're very lucky to have Akram Khan here to talk about it. He's fresh from his performances of Xenos at the White Light Festival. I don't know how many of you saw that, but it's an incredible piece. Apparently his last full evening length solo, so an extraordinary piece, a very strenuous and emotionally difficult piece to get through, he told me recently. So just a few words about Akram. He began as an Indian classical dancer in the form called kathak, which is a highly virtuosic and very beautiful and very refined dance from northern India. And then he moved on to contemporary dance and has formed this choreographic language that is all his own and is impressionistic and lyrical and expressive, while still maintaining that strong rhythmic pulse from kathak. So we're very lucky to have him, and apparently he's making a new work for New York next year, which perhaps he'll talk a little bit about. So I'd like to introduce Akram Khan. Hello.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Welcome to New York. Well, you've been here, right? Because you were dancing Xenos.
Yeah.
What was that like?
I have a very long and wonderful relationship with the White Light Festival, and so it feels like coming home in a way, especially to that theater, Rose Theater. So, yeah, and I'm just amazed. I mean, I'm wearing this hat, but I'm just amazed by the weather.
We had a rather abrupt change of weather,
yeah,
right?
I just brought winter clothes, and I just refused to, with London weather, it changes. You have 4 seasons in one day. So
Layering.
I refuse to take my hat off,
Ever.
But it's been beautiful. The weather's been great.
Yeah.
I've really enjoyed performing here, yeah.
Wonderful. So let's talk about Giselle. It's interesting. It's your first work, I believe, for a ballet company, if I'm not mistaken.
No, it's the second.
All right.
The first piece was a shorter work that Tamara Rojo invited me to create, which was a commemoration, something about the First World War. And this is the second.
What was that one called?
Dust.
Dust.
Yeah.
Okay. So what brought you to Giselle? And this is not your classic Giselle. So what is the idea behind your Giselle?
2 questions now?
Yes.
Okay. What brought me to Giselle was a curiosity that I had. To be honest with you, I didn't choose to do Giselle. It was like this mad idea of Tamara, and she does come up with these kind of extraordinarily mad ideas. So I remember speaking to her and I said, Giselle, what is the connection? And around the same time, there were 3 other ballet companies within that same 2 months. Within 2 months, when Tamara had asked me, and they all said, would you do Giselle?
They all asked you to do Giselle?
Yeah.
How curious.
And, I was, of course, intrigued with Tamara's ENB because I had worked with them, and so, but I wanted to know what it was. And they all said, when I asked them, why do you want me to do Giselle? They said, it's the second act, not the first act. And I said, what is it about the second act? And they said, it's the spiritual aspect of it, which I also explore in my own choreography and work. And so it kind of made sense. And yeah, so. Touching
on supernatural, spiritual, otherworldly themes.
Yeah, and the idea that art can represent itself in a formless way. It doesn't. It's not about just the form. It's about what you cannot see, or what you cannot hear, but you can feel. And so this has been. I grew up in a Muslim family, but my mother, as a child, when I was a child, she confused me because she told me stories from Hinduism, Judaism, Christianity, and she said these are mythologies that, you know, and so I grew up in a kind of more spiritual upbringing, and thanks to my father, he inserted Bollywood in there somewhere. For him, that narrative was very important.
So this Giselle is not in a Bollywood style, I don't think.
Absolutely not.
So tell us a little bit about your ideas behind this particular.
It's funny, it's really strange to be the only voice speaking about the ideas of Giselle, because I have to be honest that I don't come up with the ideas. It happens somewhere in flow between a discussion, in a conversation. So I never have a clear idea of what I want to do. Of course, Tamara was the one who suggested Giselle and proposed it, so she planted the seed already. But how do we look at Giselle, such an iconic piece? Also, you know, it's England's most loved ballet. So I was a little bit terrified about the patronage of it and what comes with it. And so it was through conversation with Ruth Little, my dramaturg, and you know, what we both tend to do. So it's not just me alone, but it's also Ruth. What we both tend to do is to see anything that comes in front of us, but see it from a perspective of what is happening around us. So there's a relevance, there's a relevancy there.
Right.
And there's also a sense of placing that subject in the moment where we are. And there was a huge migrant, and still is, a huge number of migrants that were coming in and were all over the news. And unfortunately, we've arrived here today with Brexit, anyway. And so there was a little boy that a lot of you might know, had seen that image that washed up on shore. And it affected me, and it affected everyone, really. And so there's a quote by John Berger, this wonderful art critic and writer, who said, "Never again will a single story be told as if it were the only one." And so I wanted to, both Ruth and I wanted to put Giselle in context of what's happening around us. So that was the first thing that we wanted to tackle. The other thing was, you know, there's a kind of thinking that I always try to give myself, is that I asked myself, when did Noah build the ark? And it's not before the rain came. It was, it was not after the rain, it was before the rain. So there's a proposition that I always try to prepare something before the storm comes in. And the storm that I thought was going to come was the idea of when does it not become Giselle? If I take away the music, is it still Giselle? Mm-hmm. If I take away the choreography, is it somebody else's choreography? Is it still Giselle? Or if I take away the narrative? And one of the things that Tamara, myself, and the collaborative team felt was, the challenge that I had was I didn't want to present it in the way that I would do, in the way that I would abstract the narrative and the rules of the classical theme and completely present it in a new context. How do I still invite the classical audience to see this version?
Interesting question.
It's easier for me to do the contemporary audience because I live in that world. That's really the place where I make work. But how do I still convince the classical audience? And so, you know, that was a huge challenge that I tried to see everything through that perspective. So, and it was interesting when you talk to different people. A dancer might say, well, if you take away the steps, it's not Giselle. Somebody else will say, if you take away the narrative, it's not Giselle. And so, yeah, it was that was one of the anchors of our process, really.
Had you seen Giselle before you even started thinking about this? Before this project? Is it a ballet that you had seen in the theater?
Before Tamara had mentioned Giselle to me, proposed Giselle, I hadn't, unfortunately.
It didn't reside somewhere in your memory?
No, I saw Swan Lake, and, you know, I fell asleep because it was, but it was my mother's fault because she took me.
Her fault?
Yeah, because she took me to the Royal Opera House, and it was a bunch of aunties with my mum who went to see this show, which is fair enough. I was 10, and for some reason it was a day out. It was like this feminist group that had a day out, and they went to the cinema first, and they dragged me along because I think they didn't know where to leave me. And so we saw Gandhi before seeing Swan Lake.
Great double header. Perfect.
So you can imagine, it's a 3-hour bloody film, political film. And I was 10, and then I went to see Swan Lake. And so it was not a good introduction into seeing a classical ballet. But then after I spoke with Tamara, I started to look at the classical versions. And the one that really struck me, which was a contemporary version, which blew me away actually, was Matt Seck's version. Is seminal.
It's set in an insane asylum, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So not your classical Giselle.
No.
I think it would be helpful to have an example, something that we can then talk about. So to have a little bit of your Giselle to get a sense of the production. I think we're going to have, well, first of all, we have these 3 wonderful dancers from English National Ballet. We've got Irina Takahashi, James Streeter, and Stina Kwajabur. But the first excerpt we're going to see is a pas de deux, I believe, for Irina Takahashi and James Streeter. And then you're going to coach them a little bit so we get a little bit of a sense of how you work with the dancers in the studio. So do you want to set it up a little?
Yeah, it's really challenging to set something up because it's out of context.
Yeah, exactly.
But I'll try. It's basically, you know, when you talk to people, or you could say your loved one. My wife is Japanese, and you know, when I'm talking to her, there's things I want to say, but because of culturally, you're not sure when is the right moment to say it, and then she has something to say, so we come with the intention to say something, and we end up talking about other things and avoiding the thing because it was never the right moment. And so this is a little bit like that, where Albrecht wants to reveal that he's from the other family. He's not what she thinks he is, and kind of reveal his identity. He's trying to at this moment, and she's trying to tell him that she's pregnant.
And so this is first act, right?
It's in the first act, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So shall we start with the pas de deux then? Come back and take a bow. Come and take a bow.
So, thank you. This is kind of weird because I have to pretend that this is a rehearsal. And I've never been in this situation. It's the first time yeah, anyway. So perhaps we could have, one of the things, do you want to come forward in the line? One of the things that that I was really keen to explore was the idea of coming into a process or a loaded piece, if you like, empty. Because I'm very aware with my own training, when I come with Indian classical dance, I come with a certain knowledge and information. And one of the things that we spoke about was about kind of leaving that behind in a way, or just parking it on the side and coming empty, because then we could fill new approaches or new ideas or new ways of looking at it. So perhaps just as an example, even if there's no fault, I've got to find a fault for them. So maybe we could have a look at just the beginning, but we could do it, imagine the wall is here, and we just do it here, perhaps, without music. Okay, great. Thank you. So for me, what's important is I didn't want to look at Giselle through a male perspective, through a man's gaze, because I couldn't relate to Giselle in the romantic sense. My mother is a feminist and a strong one. And my wife is Japanese, so she's strong. And my daughter is 5 and scares the shit out of me. So I have this huge respect and growing up with my mother to see her fight. And so she wanted to represent herself as a woman, not from a male's gaze, not from the Bangladeshi man's perspective, but she wanted to identify herself and have an identity that was belonged to her. And so one of the things that we explored was the idea of a neutral face. It's difficult to talk about them right now because they embody it. So they've been doing it for a while. So it's a tricky situation because they know it so deeply. They've done it enough. But what I'm trying to say is I try to look for the body to tell the narrative first. I don't want it in the face. And I find the face dishonest always. I think partly because of my father. That sounds wrong. But partly because he was a restaurant owner. He owned an Indian restaurant. And for me, he was, so I'm a curry house kid. So we grew up above my dad's restaurant, and in the 80s, 90s, I used to work with my dad in the restaurant to help out in the summer. And it was very complicated because there was a lot of racism in that period. And so looking at being in that environment of an Indian restaurant where my father has to smile to people who were xenophobic and who would smash bottles, or beer glasses over my head and his head, I have a huge amount of respect, but when I saw the smile, I felt, I was a kid, so I didn't quite understand why he wouldn't just rebel. Later, as I grew up, I realized that he needed the money of the people paying for the food, so it could provide food for us. And so there was a whole reasoning behind it, but I only understood that later. But to see his face, and I felt, Dad, you're being dishonest. Why are you not? So I trust the face less. I always trust the body first, my first instinct. And one of the things that we explored when we were doing it is, I would say, try and keep the face as neutral as possible. But not for the show, not until it's earned, in a sense. Because when you put yourself in the situation, the body will go into a certain environment, the situation that Giselle is in, a migrant, that's just come ashore. They're unstable, they feel they don't have a land, they're in this new place, and so they put themselves in that atmosphere. But I wanted them to visualize it in the head and then physicalize it, to express the condition of what they feel physically. And then if it bleeds into the face, that was more genuine for me. And so, of course, it's unfair and it's difficult to say because they know it, they've been through the whole process. So I feel there's an honesty there. But in the beginning, it was quite interesting working with the dancers where the first thing is to do is to literalize it through the face, to express it. But I felt I wanted the body to speak first, as if the face was had a mask on or a shell. Am I going over time?
I just wanted to ask, was there some certain exercise that you used with the dancers to get them to either relax their face, or was there a sort of process that you went through at the very start to prompt what you're talking about?
The first thing I would do is kind of I like to limit people to the point where they doubt everything in terms of intention. So should we try something with the face where you touch the face and no, just standing? Is there a moment like at the back where you would when you call her, she comes, yeah. Okay, stop. No, that's it. So for me, this is what I'm looking for. It's
not being able to rely on what you've already learned in a pas de deux situation.
Yeah, and also what you learned from the old Giselle, the classical Giselle.
Right.
Because you carry that with you. The body is like a museum. It carries. You can't just shut it out and compartmentalize it. The mind can sometimes do that, but emotions are so in part of the body. So. Okay, so thank you. So one of the things which is interesting is it's more complex because James and Irina are husband-wife.
Oh.
So there's a whole language there that they, shorthand that they have. But what I try to do is to kind of simplify it to not Giselle and Albert, but to Irina and James. I'm really interested in the person, human being, a bit like an actor.
So getting past the layers, in a way, the performance layers to the person.
Yes, because the truth of the movement or gestures lies on the streets. It lies in life. And then it's about taking that, and then you can exaggerate or you can manipulate it. But I was interested to go back to the I'm interested in seeing Irina in Giselle.
Right.
Or Giselle in Irina. Sorry, that's what I'm interested in. Giselle in Irina.
Yes.
And also James, because there's the truth lies there for me. That
Right.
you have to connect with the narrative, with a part of your own life.
Do you want to show another part, or shall we
Yeah.
come back? Okay.
Do you want us to continue?
Well,
Sorry, hold on.
I'd love to talk to Tamara, actually, so
Yes.
maybe we should move on. Thank you
Thank
guys
you.
so much.
Thank you.
So I would love to invite Tamara Rojo to join us, the director of English National Ballet, and of course a star of the Royal Ballet for many years. So welcome. Tamara.
Hi.
So this was your idea.
Yes. Guilty as charged.
So I'll ask you the same thing that I asked Akram. Why Giselle and why Akram?
Well, I've been a fan of Akram for many years and as an audience member, which is why I first invited him to do Dust for us. And the experience of Dust was incredible for myself, but for the whole company. All that process of, as he said, releasing years of layers that you acquire through experience and sometimes you come to rely on as a performer, and trying to find a different honesty and a deeper honesty perhaps. And it was very important for that work because it was to commemorate the First World War.
You're talking about Dust.
Dust, yeah.
What year did that? I'm sorry, I should know. So it was
2014.
2014.
Yeah. So it was the beginning of the war. And then, so that experience was incredibly profound for myself, but also, as I said, for all the dancers. And also it gave me more of an insight into Akram. I mean, I had already seen that spiritual side, and then I could see the human side. And Giselle was the first classical ballet I ever performed. And it was a ballet very dear to me because I performed it at very important parts of my career. It was the first ballet I performed at the Royal Opera House, and in fact the ballet that got me the job there. So, and I did many different versions. And so I knew it quite well, and I felt that it was a piece that, again, could really be liberated to a certain extent by having Akram look at those both sides, because that's why I came to realize that he has this spirituality from his background, but also he has all the other raw honesty, and that I believed Act One needed if he was to be a Giselle of today.
Right.
And it was these two sides that, for me, made it clear, you know, that he was the perfect person to tackle Giselle again.
Yeah. There's a lot of joy in Giselle, actually, in the first act, and you've left that. As you said, there are aspects of the Giselle story and of the Giselle ballet that you've left in your version, including the joy of the first act.
Yeah. It's the essence of Giselle is love, betrayal, and forgiveness. And one of the rules talking about leaving stuff in or being inspired by it was, I didn't want to also work. Tamara has such knowledge, and it would be a shame if I started to go 100% and make it my way. It's really a collaboration with Tamara and the dancers. So they were informing me. So we met in the middle, you know, because I'm very careful that I don't want to make classical dancers look like contemporary dancers without using their classical training. So I was learning much about the technique, the classical technique, as they were learning about contemporary movement. So it was really a coming together in the middle. So the same principle applied to the narrative, that we wanted to leave parts of it and explore parts of it that were already there.
Would someone who knows the original Giselle recognize every episode of the story by seeing yours? Would they say, this is Giselle?
That depends on the person, I think. It's really tricky, yeah. I don't know, Tamara? What
I think they will recognize, if they really know it, more than that, because there are patterns that we've kept in the corps de ballet, patterns in the peasants. There is certain mime even between Bathilde and Giselle. So if you know it really well, then you will recognize quite a lot. And melodies in the music.
Yeah. I thought it's interesting, you actually, there's like a crown, almost like a crown mime, right?
Yeah.
So, which you're getting very, very close to ballet mime there.
Yeah. Well, ballet mime.
Well,
I mean, my father says everything comes from India. So until we realized, actually, it comes from Africa. And he's still convinced that's wrong. He convinced me when I was a child, because I was so obsessed with Madonna, that he convinced me Madonna was actually Mahendra from India.
Could be.
So, could be. But so gestures is very much part of Indian classical dance.
Of course, yeah.
So also in ballet, I suppose, they use gestures, and we use it too. So there are similarities in terms of...
It's wonderful. So there's an overlap, like an almost natural overlap there between these two classical forms.
Yeah, I think also what's the overlap is the rigor.
Yeah.
That's what the classical dance shares, the both forms. I definitely don't think kathak is close to ballet in terms
Except
of...
for the turns.
In the physical... Yes, turns, yes.
Turns.
But in the physical sense, the relationship to the floor, I've always wanted to go up, but I've always ended up going down to the floor. And so that lent itself towards kathak, an Indian classical dance, because we go down and then ballet goes up. So in a sense, they're kind of going the opposite direction. But the sense of turns, there are a lot of similarities, yeah.
Yeah, they're actually, yeah. Tamara, you've danced Giselle so many times. What is it like to dance this Giselle, physically, mentally? What are the similarities and what are the absolute, divergences?
For me, it's a joy to dance this Giselle. The similarities are, physically, it's very difficult to find similarities because it is so very different technically, and also the grounding of the piece is so different. Other than the spiritual journey, which in a way is the same. I always do struggle, especially as I grew older, with the naivety and side of many roles, not just Giselle. So for me, at this point in my life, obviously, this Giselle, I can find it easier within myself. A woman that is expecting a child, that's had to survive a journey, that has to fight for her own people, that has, and like you said, one of the beautiful aspects of this Giselle is that she is the engine of the joy on the stage. She is the bringing of hope. She is the leader of her own community, and the fighter for them. For me, this journey is one that satisfies me a lot more. And also the second act, I found a new meaning that if I had to do Giselle again, the classical version, I would love to carry that to this new version, because we always talk about the forgiveness of Giselle, but very often when you do the classical version, all you see is sorrow for the self. So very often you see ballerinas, and I did that myself, we go into this pattern that second act you're just sad, and just this constant sadness, and I find that eventually doesn't go anywhere. And with this Giselle, Akram was very clear that there is a joy in her forgiveness, and there is a joy in the encounter, and in her looking for the human feeling again of touch and smells, and trying to repeat those moments that she had with Albrecht in the first act, but not through a spirituality necessarily, but really through her physicality. She wants him to touch her again. She wants to feel again. She wants to be alive again. And and she wants him to live without any sorrow. I think once you are in that other side, there is no sorrow for yourself because you see the truth. And I love that, and I wish I had known that in time when I was doing the classical Giselle, because I think I would have found that so much more fulfilling.
English, sorry, you want to add
No,
something?
what was, in addition to that, what was really interesting that with Giselle, it couldn't have been done without Tamara and Alina.
Alina
Yes.
Kojokaro.
Yes, both of them, because they were. Tamara had her own way of approaching me and questioning the narrative, and it was extraordinary because it really allowed us to question things that her from the inside, because I'm coming in from the outside, she's coming from the inside. So there was a real conversation there. And Alina, being Alina, she would write long psychological texts every night. About what was the intention of this, and she's extraordinary, both of them extraordinary, but complete different approaches.
So you were working with them at the same time?
Yes, they were always, I insisted that they be in the same studio at the same time, because they learn from each other. They're both so smart in different ways, and one watches the other. It's so beautiful to see. I mean, I'm always excited to see Tamara and Alina on each night, because you know that Tamara's watched Alina and taken something from it, or said, okay, this is not how I'm going to do it. And then Alina does the same. And this is beautiful. And that's why I think it's very important that the young female and male dancers, and I kept saying, guys, you got to watch these two masters, because they're still questioning. You know, that's what's extraordinary about Tamara and Alina. They're artists. They constantly are curious. Like, there is not the naivety, there's a maturity, but the curiosity is there as a child. And the other thing was the complexity is very important of Giselle, as Tamara said, because it's a very Western concept of good and bad. Generally, I'm just generalizing, of course.
The binary.
Yes, we want to know that this is evil and this is good, straight away. And with Hindu mythology, because I studied that, and Eastern mythology, the human condition is far more complex. Within the bad, there is good. Within the good, there is bad. And of course, most of us, if I connect it directly to how we feel about our government, it's easy to say he is bad, and he or she is good, and she is bad, and he's good. But it's far more complex than that, because the human condition is far more complex.
I think, following from that, sorry if I can add something. Another thing I discovered in this Giselle is the beautiful relationship with Mirta. And again, in the classical Giselle,
see in the next excerpt,
in the classical Giselle, Mirta is the enemy of Giselle and of Albrecht. In this Giselle, I found Mirta was my mother. She's raised me from the grave. She gives me life again. She teaches me the tools of this new tribe that I belong to. She's going to teach me how to survive. She gives me my weapon, and she teaches me to kill. She shows me how to kill, and then I betray her. But I betray her through love, because I recognize that she's there because she went through the same thing. So she must have loved a man like I loved Albrecht. And I know she will allow me to have this moment with him if I just remind her of who she was. And this conversation between the daughter and the mother is one that we all have in life. At some point, I become my mother, and my mother remembers who she was when she was a teenager. And so I love that, having that on the stage between these two women.
So it sounds like it's also allowed you to rediscover Giselle in a way, to sort of read it through a new lens.
And that was very much my intention. I love the classical ballet. I love the classical canon. I completely understand when so many people feel that it is so precious, and for some people it shouldn't be touched. But I believe that we ought to question it, that we need to sometimes walk on sacred land and open the graves as such, and look inside and see what is really truly meaningful in it, and what is really truly sacred. And if we do so, then we will value it even more. We will discover new things in it.
It's interesting that you do both versions.
We do.
So do they inform each other in some way? Do the dancers bring sensations and thoughts that they develop in one?
Very much. And we did our classical traditional Giselle after we had done Akram. So all these months of research and exploration and understanding of the character, when we then went back to the tradition, it was like you say, a rediscovery of what it meant. And it was a rebirth of what was a traditional classical Giselle. And also for the audience, they were able to see in the same season both Giselles. And, you know, each person might prefer one or the other, and that's perfectly fine. But I do think that the whole journey had a deeper meaning.
Right. Akram, tell us a little bit about how you came to the actual vocabulary for this Giselle, the dance vocabulary, whether you included any element of kathak in it, or what were the ingredients? I noticed that this is danced off pointe. Is there point work in it as well?
Yes, the second half is predominantly on point. I have really shitty feet, so I can't point my feet. So I've always been terrified of point work. So I always told Sylvie Guillem when we did duets, like, no, I don't want you on point, because I don't know what to do with it. Yeah, it was also, it was a complex I had, because she was already taller than me. So her on point is like a giant, or I'm like a midget. So but my body's not in this piece, and that was really interesting. That's a very telling sign of this process, because usually my ego steps in, because my ego is in my body. And it was the first time I felt, Giselle is the first process that I felt freedom from my body. Because I was working with dancers which I don't know their language. I can appreciate. So, Tamara, Alina, Isaac, Caesar, Stina, they were all proposing movements. And then and it's difficult to say where the kathak is in the show, because kathak is storytelling. So it's just the way I look at, the way you look at something. It's not necessarily the vocabulary. Yes, I proposed some vocabulary, but it was a lot of research we had done with dancers who were not part of the company anymore, but ex-dancers of ENB, and so some of the material was made with them, because I wasn't under the pressure of having so many dancers in the room. So we explored, we took time, and also very close to Giselle, 1 year before was Until the Lions, a piece for my company, and it was from a female perspective. So there was a similarity to, I could see Amba in Giselle and Giselle in Amba.
Right.
Amba is from the Mahabharata, character from the Mahabharata.
So I think we should see another excerpt. I think we're going to see a trio, and this is from the second act, I believe. So it's Giselle and Albrecht and the Queen of the Willies. So it will be Irina and James, and also Stina Kwajabur, who is she Mirta? Do you have a Mirta? Do you call her that?
Yes, she's Mirta, yeah.
Do you want to set it up, or shall we just go right into it?
I think we should just go right into it.
Shall we go into it? Perfect. Second excerpt. Come out. Come out and take a bow. Come back and take a bow. Would you like to take a bow? All right, I guess not. Okay. Well, I almost feel like we should end with that because it's so powerful, but I do want to talk to Patricia Barretto of the Harris Theater. And when Stina has rested a tiny little bit, perhaps she'll come and join us as well. So yes, please, Patricia, come and join us. Oh, how quick. So Patricia, you're the president and CEO of the Harris Theater in Chicago.
That's right.
Tell us how you discovered this production and why you decided you had to have it.
Well, it's really interesting because I'm a huge fan of Akram and his work. And in 2016, when I read the story that Tamara had approached him to reimagine Giselle, I thought, wow, that sounds incredibly intriguing. And then I further discovered that not only is he redoing it, but it's also going to be set on the stories of migrants. And I am a migrant. I've moved twice now in my lifetime, from India to Canada, and from Canada to the United States. So when I heard about the story and I heard about how it's going to change, and it spoke to me on so many levels, emotionally, personally. And my entire career, I've always worked in the Western classical arts. And so to have a little bit of my roots represented in this timeless Western tale just felt absolutely right in that moment. And so when I had the opportunity to curate my first season for the Harris, that was the first thing that went on my list, the new Giselle.
How does it fit into your general philosophy of programming there?
You know, the Harris, we're a young theater in Chicago. We're still a baby. We're only 15 years old. We're right in Millennium Park, in the heart of everything that's going on in the city. And we're surrounded by wonderful legacy institutions like the opera and the ballet and the symphony and all of those things. But the Harris, we really do call ourselves Chicago's home for music and dance. And for me, it was really important, if we are going to be Chicago's home for music and dance, then let's just break open the doors and make sure we are reflecting the community that we're serving in Chicago. So we always did wonderful orchestral pieces in jazz and the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, and they were always wonderful on our stage. But I felt that we weren't necessarily representing the entire community. We weren't bringing them all in. And I really believe that the only way to bring the community in is for them to see themselves on the stage, for their stories to be represented on stage. And if you aren't doing that, then you're not serving the community. And so for me, in terms of programming at the Harris, it is about pushing the envelope. And I was so impressed with Tamara and the bravery and the risk-taking to go back to this timeless tale, because that's exactly what I'm hoping to do with the programming at the Harris. Is we'll continue to do the wonderful orchestras and ballet and jazz and all of those things, but I want to make sure that we're also pushing the boundaries, getting more global, including global voices and artists from all over the world.
Stina, it must be difficult to come out of something that intense and just sort of rejoin the regular, banal, world.
It is. Every time you do it, actually, it's, I don't know if you can push that in. Is that better? Every time I think you perform Akram's work, Dust, as well as Giselle, but especially Giselle, because it's a full-length program, you get so immersed in the piece. A lot of people are involved in the whole story, and we were talking about it the other day, that you don't just have your role, your part, and then you go off stage and you come back and you do your little role. Everybody is involved emotionally, down to the person in the group, in the ensemble, to every other character. Everyone is so into the story, and it's always a little bit to come out of it is always a bit of a shock. This is only a small part, but when you do the whole of Act 2, it's like going into a whole other world, and that's really special in Akram's work. Yeah.
What are the challenges of the actual movement style for a ballet dancer? And a very accomplished one, obviously.
Yeah, working with Akram's very special, I think, because he's really putting what he does, his background, kathak, to what we do. And it's a real merge, fusion of styles, and your input is as important. And he's an enormous, incredible, talented dancer, and watching him in the studio is like, sometimes he does things and you're kind of thinking, how are we supposed to do anything like that? But it's putting the attack or something of what he does into what we do, and there's a real kind of mesh. And I think the challenges are that you have to be open as a dancer to push yourself physically in a different zone, something that you don't know, something that's uncomfortable, into something. There is no set example of it yet, especially when you're creating it. He has his world and we have ours, and you're going into an in-between that doesn't exist yet. There's something there that you're creating, and you have to push physically to see where that can go. And I think that's what's special, and I think you have to be really open, and you have to do it again and again, full out physically to find that place. You can't do it by just talking about it. You really have to physically push yourself there.
Is it a big shift then to go back to classical ballet?
I don't think so. I think Akram Giselle has really made people question, I think you were talking about it earlier, question all the other characters and all the other roles they do. I think because it's a performance, it's different every show as well. There is so much feeling and connection in the show. Because you're so involved emotionally as a character, you do things differently in the shows by what happens and by how you feel and how different characters are responding to you. And sometimes classical ballet can be very much, this is what it's set, and we do it the same way every time. And I think a lot of the company has come back to classical ballet and gone, well, how is my character thinking and feeling? And kind of gone in a lot more emotionally and physically thinking about it, and then actually going, well, do I have to do it exactly like this? Or can we slightly shift it? Not necessarily the steps and the actual choreography, but just very subtle things, more of an emotional reasons and timings maybe, or just responding differently. And I think that's really helped me, being a dancer for a long time in the company, just going back to works that we've done before and thinking, I can get more out of this than I'm doing.
Right. It's like a continual process.
Yeah.
Well, I think with that, we're going to draw to a close. I want to bring the dancers on, and also Akram, for a final bow, but before that I want to thank Works in Process and Carolyn Cronson, Tamara, Akram, the dancers, Patricia. Thank you all very much, and let's have a final round of applause. Good night, everyone.